19th of November 1942, after months of fierce fighting, General Friedrich Paulus thought he had the city of Stalingrad within his grasp. But his confidence was shattered when he received alarming reports from the units guarding his flanks. Soviet forces were attacking in unbelievable strength from their bridgeheads over the Don. German divisions were being engulfed by wave upon wave of massed Soviet armor, heavily supported by untold numbers of aircraft and artillery pieces. The next day, the Soviets attacked in the south with equal effect. By the 23rd of November, the encirclement was complete. Some 300,000 Axis soldiers were trapped inside Stalingrad. Paulus reported that his 6th Army had only enough food for a week and that fuel and ammunition were running low. His senior commanders begged him to order a breakout, but Paulus's superior, Field Marshal von Manstein, refused to hear of it. Hitler insisted that Festung Stalingrad hold out until relieved. The expression fortress gave false comfort. The troops had no proper fortifications, just the holes in the frozen ground they had managed to excavate with their remaining explosives. The temperature sank remorselessly. Blizzards swept across the steppe. Huddled in underground bunkers, the 6th Army counted the days until a relief operation rescued them. Fighting rations were reduced to 200 grams of horse meat and 200 grams of bread per day. Support troops received half that, and there was nothing at all for Soviet prisoners held inside the pocket. Yet the ordinary soldiers believed, against mounting evidence to the contrary, that Hitler would get them out. Manstein failed to relieve the trapped army. He sent Generaloberst Hermann Hoth to blast a way through the Soviet lines on the 12th of December, and in a week of desperate fighting, Hoth's Panzer Corps got close enough to see the horizon lit up at night, flares rising and falling over the pocket. But the Soviets attacked the Italian and Romanian armies along the River Shir, northwest of Stalingrad. Another great breakthrough was achieved, and Hoth's relief force was compelled to turn away and meet the new threat. The 6th Army was abandoned. Stalin ordered the pocket crushed in January, and a renewed Soviet Blitzkrieg broke into the perimeter west of the city. Some 25,000 sick and wounded were evacuated, but a far greater number of men died as frostbitten limbs and wounds turned gangrenous. Anesthetic ran out. No rations were given to the wounded after the 11th of January. Hitler promoted Paulus to full general and then to field marshal, on the tacit understanding that no German field marshal had ever been taken alive. But Paulus refused to kill himself and surrendered on the 30th of January. Small parties of troops broke out onto the steppe, trying to make their way back to safety. Some were spotted from time to time by Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. None made it. Of the 300,000 men in the pocket, 91,000 survived to surrender, of whom half would be dead before spring. Only 5,000 would ever return from Soviet captivity. The last stand of the 6th Army delayed a general Soviet offensive long enough to allow other German forces to retreat and regroup. The reduction and final destruction of the Stalingrad pocket occupied 7 Soviet armies until the last day of January 1943, armies that would otherwise have joined their comrades in a massive drive west. But the blow to German prestige was severe. The Russian winter still gripped the land when Paulus surrendered. Red Army elation at their victory and the good going provided by the frozen ground tempted the Soviets into widespread attacks. Any penetrations of the German lines were swiftly exploited. Within days, Soviet tank battalions were racing across the open steppe west of the river Donets, overtaking scattered groups of retreating Germans. On the 26th of January, they recovered Voronezh. By the 8th of February, they were through Kursk and driving for the railway at Suzemka. Ahead lay the Dnieper crossings and the giant hydroelectric plant at Zaporozhye. North, and about to be surrounded, lay the industrial city of Kharkov. The latter was abandoned by its SS garrison on the 14th of February, ignoring Hitler's orders to hold fast. Kharkov was the first major city to be liberated. 18 months of Nazi occupation had reduced its population by 25%. Some 100,000 young men and women had been deported to Germany as slave laborers. And since Hitler and Goering had made it clear that Russian civilians would be allowed to starve, another 100,000 people, mostly the old and very young, had died over the winter. About 15,000 people had been shot out of hand during the occupation. University teachers, Communist Party members, Soviet government officials, and all Jews. Starving Russian soldiers wandered the streets, released from a nearby prisoner of war camp. Their condition had not improved. They were liable to arrest by the NKVD, Stalin's feared secret police. The NKVD regarded all ex-prisoners as traitors for having surrendered. 2 weeks after the liberation of Kharkov, the Red Army was at Pavlograd, only 25 miles from the Dnieper, and quite close to Hitler, who was paying a flying visit to Zaporozhye. Hitler had come to confer with his commanders. At quiet moments in the conference, the sound of Russian artillery could just be made out. Field Marshal von Manstein had a clear plan for stabilizing the desperate situation in the east, and he persuaded the Führer to let him fight the battle his way instead of conducting the rigid defense which Hitler usually favored. The result was a tactical masterstroke, still studied in military academies today. Manstein's plans took into account the iron laws of logistics now hampering the Soviets. The leading Red Army formations were separated by miles of devastated country from their bases. Red Army staff officers lacked experience of feeding huge, rapidly advancing armies. Worst of all, the Germans were now reorganized and well supplied, poised to cut them to pieces. Manstein let the Soviet advance continue, while he assembled a powerful striking force on its flanks, consisting of SS Panzergrenadier divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf, combined with 5 Army Panzer divisions and the Großdeutschland division. There was massive support from a newly reinforced Luftwaffe. Manstein sprang his first trap on the 20th of February. On the day that the forward Russian patrols reached Pavlograd, panzers were driving up the west bank of the Donets behind them. Their aim was to smash into the flank of the 3rd Soviet Tank Army and destroy it. In what he dubbed his backhand blow, Manstein drove east to cut off all the Russian forces that had broken over the Donets. By the 3rd of March, the Russians had been forced to abandon nearly 6,000 square miles of their recent gains. The SS Panzer Corps stormed Kharkov in mid-March, and Belgorod was retaken. By the end of the month, the 4 Soviet tank corps strung out between the Donets and Zaporozhye were annihilated. The Battle of Kharkov improved the German position, just as the spring thaw imposed its annual halt on military operations. The startling recovery of the Ostir, the army in the east, after the Stalingrad disaster unsettled Stalin, who made a tentative diplomatic approach to Hitler via Swedish diplomats. But the Führer remained set on decisive victory and the extermination of what he still regarded as the Jewish Bolshevik threat. Hitler's army was outnumbered 2 to 1 in men, 5 to 1 in tanks and guns, but the Wehrmacht knew that its training and tactical leadership were far superior to that of the Red Army. Even though the odds did not favor a 3rd successive large-scale summer offensive in 1943, the German Army High Command was nevertheless determined on an attack. There was little thought of knocking Russia out of the war, however much Hitler clung to the dream of final victory. His generals were more pragmatic. They wanted to attack in order to cripple the Soviet army. With the loss of North Africa, it was only a matter of time before the Allies attacked Italy or even landed in France. Unless the Red Colossus could be smashed before then, a nightmare loomed. A 2-front war that Germany could never win. The front line had stabilized, running from west of Rostov in the south up to Velikia Luki west of Moscow, then to Leningrad. However, a huge Soviet salient protruded 80 kilometers westwards in front of Kursk, from just north of Belgorod up to the line of Ponyeri. The salient was about 200 kilometers wide at its base. This was the bulge on the map which drew all German eyes during the weeks which followed. It positively invited attack. Not only would its removal flatten the line of the front, but it would provide a sound strategic base for a drive deep into Russia. Initial orders for the offensive, code-named Operation Citadel, were issued by OKH, the German Army High Command, on the 13th of March, 1943. The outlines of the plan were quite simple. Army Group Center would attack from the north with a massively reinforced panzer group, while Army Group South would strike northwards from the opposite side of the salient with even stronger forces. The Soviets had never previously managed to halt a determined German summer assault without giving up hundreds of kilometers of territory. The German High Command assumed, and the Soviet generals feared, that it would be no different this time. The panzers had to break through little more than 100 kilometers to cut off all Soviet units in the salient. Further exploitation might take them back to the Don at Voronezh. Elimination of the Kursk bulge would also bring the Wehrmacht into a position to threaten Moscow. In fact, the follow-up operation envisaged by OKH was Operation Parkplatz, the storming of Leningrad. 9 divisions were earmarked for the assault, and the super-heavy siege artillery used to batter Sevastopol into submission was en route north. It was not destined to arrive. Kursk was such an obvious objective that the Russians began fortifying it almost as soon as the Germans decided to attack. As early as March, Marshal Georgy Zhukov and his front commanders were presenting Stalin with their thoughts on likely German plans for the coming campaigning season. Their predictions proved to be remarkably accurate. In addition, the Red Army planned new offensives of its own, scheduled to open the moment the German attack stalled. Stalin and his most senior commanders gambled that they could hold Kursk against the elite panzer divisions, absorb the full strength of the German blow, then unleash a multi-front offensive that would liberate the Ukraine. Hitler postponed his attack several times in order to bring his forces up to maximum strength and to employ the latest heavy tanks now in production. These delays were the cause of some debate in the German High Command. Manstein, who had shown the value of fast-moving fluid actions at Kharkov, wanted to launch the attack as soon as possible after the spring thaw to give the Soviets the least possible time to prepare defenses. General Walter Model, whose Ninth Army would spearhead the attack, wanted to bring his forces up to even greater strength to counter the Soviet defenses that were already there. General Heinz Guderian, returned from disgrace as inspector of panzer troops, was against the operation altogether. Bullying head-on into the Soviets would waste men and tanks, losses the Wehrmacht would ill be able to afford when the Allies made their expected landings in Europe the following year. Hitler himself was nervous. In a conversation with Guderian in May, he admitted that, "When I think of this attack, my stomach turns over." Nevertheless, he followed Model's advice rather than Manstein or Guderian. The best and most experienced soldiers from the entire Wehrmacht had been concentrated into the attack area. As General Mellenthin was to write, no offensive was ever prepared as carefully as this one. Hitler's order for the operation ended. Victory at Kursk will be a beacon for the whole world. Key to Hitler's confidence were 3 new heavy armored vehicles. The massive Tiger tank had been introduced to the east on the Leningrad front earlier in the year. Thickly armored and with a powerful 88mm gun, the Tiger was expected to cut a swathe through the T-34s, which had proved so daunting since their first appearance in 1941. The Elephant, a self-propelled gun, mounted a long-barreled 88mm cannon onto a prototype Tiger chassis. It was expected to provide long-range protection for the panzer forces. Since it was supposed to engage from standoff positions, it was not provided with defensive machine guns, a fatal error. When used correctly, the Elephant proved terrifyingly effective, but many were lost to breakdowns which left them vulnerable to infantry attacks. The third new weapon entering action for the first time was the Panther, the German answer to the T-34. Larger, heavier, and with a lethal long-barrel 75mm gun, it was to go on to become the best tank of the war, but it was expensive and complex to build. The Panther was rushed into action over the objections of Guderian, who felt that it needed more development before becoming combat-worthy. He was right. Panthers at Kursk were extremely unreliable. Conventional tank forces were also upgraded. The 75mm gun of the long-barreled Panzer IV could penetrate the heaviest Soviet tanks at combat ranges. Additional armor plate protected the vulnerable sides and rear of the tank against the anti-tank rifles carried by Soviet infantry. The Panzer III was too small to be upgunned, but its high-velocity 50mm cannon could destroy T-34s at close range. It also provided the basis for the Sturmgeschütz III, an excellent assault gun with a fixed 75mm cannon, which provided direct fire support for the German infantry. Air power, the other essential component of Blitzkrieg, was not in such a good state. Fighter strength was low, as many aircraft had been deployed back to Germany to cover the homeland against Allied bombing raids. 400 aging Ju-87 Stukas were expected to provide the bulk of close air support at a time when they were becoming increasingly vulnerable to Soviet countermeasures. Furthermore, many of the flak guns, which were supposed to protect the Luftwaffe's forward air bases, had been siphoned off to provide anti-tank protection for the ground forces. Above all, 6th Air Fleet in the north and 4th Air Fleet in the south had only 2/3 of the fuel they needed to maintain an adequate presence over the whole battlefield. However, pilots and commanders expected that the Luftwaffe's experience and tradition of victory would be enough to counter the rapidly growing Red Air Force. German confidence was increasingly ill-founded. Hitler and his advisors did not recognize that the Red Army which they now faced was a very different proposition from that of the past. However anxious some of Stalin's frontline commanders were, Marshal Zhukov and the High Command, the Stavka, were confident the Red Army of 1943 was far more proficient than the stumbling giant of 1941 or the gallant amateurs of 1942. The Red Army learned from its mistakes. After-action reports were compiled within weeks of the end of the winter campaigns, and the lessons were passed down the chain of command with great speed. A Tiger had been captured at Leningrad early in the year, and methods of stopping it were being worked out. By the summer of 1943, the Soviets had developed large-scale armored and mechanized forces, with fully mobile supporting arms and an adequate command structure. A new tactical and strategic approach envisioned using these forces in independent deep strike operations. The Stavka had also found commanders with the ability and initiative to make best use of the new tank armies being deployed at Kursk. Above all, Stalin was listening to his military advisors and interfering less in operational matters. The Soviet T-34 medium tank had not been upgraded since 1941. Tank for tank, the new German machines were better. However, Soviet efforts had been expended in increasing production rather than improving design, and tank strength had risen from 7,000 vehicles at the beginning of 1942 to more than 20,000 a year later. This was a production rate the Germans could not match. The Wehrmacht's inventory rose from 4,900 tanks to 5,650 over the same period. As a partial solution to the problem presented by German heavy tanks like the Tiger, Soviet designers developed the ISU-152. This was a 152mm howitzer mounted on a KV-2 heavy tank chassis, which could be used as an assault gun or as a tank killer. It was known to the Red Army troops as the Zveroboy, or animal hunter, due to its ability to deal with the German Tigers and Panthers. The great Soviet production effort was repeated in all areas of weapons manufacture. By the time the Germans attacked at Kursk, Soviet rifle and mechanized armies were fully equipped with artillery, anti-tank guns, anti-aircraft weaponry, mortars, and combat engineering equipment. The KV-1 heavy tank, too slow to be used in the tank armies, was assigned to support infantry formations. Technical improvements were more noticeable in the air. For the first time, the Red Air Force could contest with the Luftwaffe on equal terms. The Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik was a heavily armored ground attack aircraft built in huge numbers. These were protected in the air by a series of new fighters from Lavochkin and Yakovlev, with performance to match the best German designs. When Operation Citadel finally opened on the 5th of July, 1,800 tanks and 900 assault guns spearheaded the ground battle. Heavy strike power was provided by 147 Tigers, 200 Panthers, and 89 Elephants, but the bulk of the Panzer battalions was still using older Panzer IIIs and IVs. At 2 a.m. on the 5th of July, an hour before the Wehrmacht's opening barrage was due to launch the great offensive, hundreds of Soviet guns opened up. Soviet artillery blanketed the German assembly areas, killing hundreds of waiting troops and wrecking important communication networks. They destroyed a large number of guns and panzers in the process, and made it abundantly clear that the Red Army knew far too much about German preparations for comfort. This was partly due to the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, which had been supplying Moscow with German military intelligence of a high order for months. By the end of June, the commanders of Central, Voronezh and Steppe fronts, Rokossovsky, Batutin and Konev, knew almost exactly the forces which would be ranged against them, what their immediate objectives were, and when they would strike. The Soviets had also made excellent use of the repeated German delays. Russian infantry had dug deeply into the black earth of central Russia. Networks of underground bunkers connected by trenches were defended by clusters of concealed anti-tank guns. The defenses were designed first to channel the panzer formations into killing grounds and then demolish them. Over 3,000 mines were laid per kilometer of front, and dug-in KV-1s and tank destroyers reinforced the 9 lines of entrenchments. German losses on that first day were reminiscent of those on the Western Front in 1916. By nightfall, 200 panzers had been knocked out and 220 German aircraft shot down. And in the days which followed, the toll rose proportionately. Whole regiments were wiped out, batteries destroyed, squadrons crushed, before the leading formations broke clear of the defense belts, only to run into the waiting Russian armor and infantry. Red Army losses were at least 5 times higher, but the Russians had the men and tanks to spare. The German Ninth Army, commanded by the determined General Oberst Model, made little progress on the northern shoulder of the salient. His forces ran headlong into the Soviet 13th Army, with the 48th and 70th Armies on each side. In savage fighting that barely let up over the short summer nights, his men advanced scarcely 10 kilometers. Citadel was more successful in the south. Hoth's panzers and Kemp's motorized infantry faced the 6th Guards Army with the 7th Guards Army on their left, all ready and waiting, all dug in behind belt after belt of murderous anti-tank defenses. At the beginning, the SS Panzer Corps smashed remorselessly through each line of defense. Again, the fighting went on 24 hours a day. The intense summer heat triggered thunderstorms by the end of each afternoon. Both sides were very active in the air, the Luftwaffe only being able to dominate selected areas of the front. The Soviets flew thousands of bomber sorties against German supply routes. The tank battles culminated in the celebrated action near the small town of Prokhorovka. On the 10th of July, the SS Vanguard, led by Totenkopf, tore through the Soviet 1st Tank Army, overrunning the 71st Guards Rifle Division. Stalin sat at his desk in the Kremlin day and night, demanding hourly situation reports. He consented to the release of 5th Guards Tank Army and the 5th Guards Army for the reserve. They moved up, ready to counterattack. But even as the Kursk battles were reaching their climax, the attention of the German High Command was drawn thousands of miles away to Sicily. On the 9th of July, Anglo-American airborne forces landed on the island, followed by a massive amphibious assault. The attack met with a commendably rapid response from the Hermann Göring Division, but it soon became clear that the island could not be held. The best the Germans could hope for was a progressive withdrawal that cost the Allies time. An attack on mainland Italy would surely follow. With the prospect of a two-front war now a reality, Hitler had to consider calling off Operation Citadel. By the 12th of July, Model's army had penetrated a mere 15 kilometers towards Ponieri, while Hoth's Panzer Army had reached the Prokhorovka area only 30 kilometers from their start line. Here they encountered the 5th Guards Tank Army in the largest and most bloody tank action of the whole battle. Same day, to the north of the Bulge, Army Group Center was attacked by Soviet forces bent on liberating Orel. The ground won at such terrible cost had to be abandoned as 9th Army pulled back to defend its own flank. As the Soviet reserves counterattacked at Prokhorovka, Hitler summoned Field Marshals Manstein and Kluger to Rastenburg. Kluger reported that Army Group Center could not maintain the offensive. 9th Army had suffered 20,000 casualties in a week, and the Russians' counter-offensive was so powerful Orel might be lost. Manstein pleaded for one more supreme effort, arguing that if he committed his last reserves, he might yet break through to Kursk. Hitler was not convinced. He called off Citadel and ordered the SS Panzer Corps to be transferred to the west. The Austere would go over to the defensive and contain the Russian drive on Orel. But Model was unable to prevent the loss of Orel, which fell on the 5th of August. The Soviet Bryansk and Kalinin fronts began new offensives in the north. Another major attack developed south of Kursk, forcing Manstein back to the scene of his triumph in the spring. This time, there was no power available for a backhand blow. All the Germans could do was fight a succession of rearguard actions as they withdrew, giving up Belgorod on the 5th of August and eventually abandoning Kharkov itself. On the 23rd of August, the city changed hands for the last time. Army Group South retreated to prepared positions running from Zaporozhye to the Black Sea. The Soviets reached the isthmus connecting the Crimea to the mainland. The German 17th Army was isolated. At Stalingrad, the Red Army had learned how to stop the German army. After Kursk, it was to show that it could drive them backwards. Soviet techniques had improved considerably, thanks to the harsh lessons taught them by their German instructors. They now practiced better field reconnaissance. Camouflage techniques were improved, and when the battle started, cooperation amongst infantry, tanks, and cavalry was good. Although the Red Army would never approach the levels of professionalism and efficiency which marked out the German war machine, the Soviets were always willing and able to use superior numbers to overcome their shortcomings. As Soviet confidence bludgeoned, that of the Germans declined. Before Stalingrad, they went into the battle with the firm belief that German efficiency and courage would inevitably bring victory. After that great defeat, the ordinary German soldier knew that if the Soviets weren't stopped, their eastern hordes would soon reach the German homelands. Kursk had been the Wehrmacht's last supreme effort to reverse months of withdrawals. But even before the ill-fated offensive, the writing was on the wall. In addition to the great losses between the Don and the Donets following the fall of Stalingrad, almost the whole of von Kleist's army group had been hastily withdrawn. Only the previous year, Kleist had been poised to capture the vital Caucasian oil fields and perhaps even break down into Persia and the Middle East. Now, he had only pulled his army group out through Rostov by the narrowest of margins. The defeat at Kursk merely accelerated the pace of the Soviet recovery. When the German attack stalled, the Red Army offensives continued, one beginning as its predecessor slowed. As Kharkov fell in the south, General Popov launched an attack out of the newly won ground around Orel towards Bryansk. Further north, the Kalinin front under Eremenko drove down towards Smolensk. 2 drives were launched in the direction of Kiev, from the Central Front under Rokossovsky and from the Voronezh Front under Vatutin. At the far south of the line, Tolbukin's southern front crossed the river Meuse, outflanked Taganrog, from which the last of Kleist's men hastily withdrew, and drove along the Azov coast to Mariupol. By mid-September, the whole Soviet front from Smolensk down to the Black Sea was on the move. Within days, Central Front had swept through Sevsk as far as Konotop. Voronezh Front was through Piryatin, and Steppe Front had reached Poltava. Southwest and southern fronts between them had cleared all enemy forces from the Donetsk basin and were within striking distance of the Dnieper at Zaporozhye. By the end of September, the Red Army had reached the Dnieper north and south of Kiev. An ambitious airborne operation was mounted in order to capture the crossings at Kanev and Bukrin, some 90 kilometers downstream. But poor intelligence resulted in one of 3 parachute divisions landing right on top of 10th Panzer Grenadier Division. The Soviet paratroopers were destroyed, and the hard-won bridgehead at Bukrin eventually abandoned. However, the Soviets had secured a tiny enclave on the west bank at Lyotlezh, 20 kilometers north of Kiev, which was rapidly reinforced by the 3rd Tank Army. To the astonishment and terror of the German armies standing in their way, the Soviet forces stormed relentlessly on. With the help of Ukrainian partisans, a bridgehead to the north of Kiev was formed, and the one surviving to the south held, despite fierce counterattack. Reinforced by units of the 38th Army, the liberation of Kiev was launched from the bridgeheads. On the 3rd of November, the German forces around the bridgeheads were shattered by the fire of some 2,000 guns. Russian tanks broke through to threaten Kiev with encirclement. By the 4th of November, more and more T-34s were arriving and grinding their way across hastily but efficiently built wooden bridges. Artillery and heavy mortars were pounding the German defenses, and Soviet infantry, many of whom had learnt their trade at Stalingrad, were fighting their way through the city streets. On the 6th of November, Kiev was once more in Soviet hands. Now the ground was frozen, the Russian winter again chilling the hearts of the German forces. For the moment, the Red Army was content to clear the rest of the Dnieper in the south and recapture a few significant places to the north. Steppe and southwest fronts drove across the river and formed a wide and deep penetration towards Krivoy Rog and Kirovograd. Southern front reached the mouth of the Dnieper and effectively shut off all German forces left in the Crimea. To the north, Vatutin and Rokossovsky had driven their fronts as far as Koroshten and the eastern edge of the Pripet marshes, and Sokolovsky had taken, by the use of 7 armies and at great cost, the massive defensive bastion that the Germans had made of Smolensk. The front continued to roll westwards during November as the Red Army recaptured Zhytomyr and Koroshten. Once again, Manstein bided his time, fending off Hitler's demands for immediate action. The Russians became overextended as their mechanized units outran their supply columns. Their air support diminished because it took time to repair captured airfields. When Manstein did counterattack, he retook both towns and re-established the direct rail link with Army Group Center. However, a Soviet breakthrough at Cherkasy, combined with Hitler's refusal to retreat from the one stretch of the Dnieper still under German control, left a dangerously exposed salient jutting into Russian territory. Although the Führer's divisions were far from being annihilated at Kursk, it was the last time when German panzers could take to the field with any real hope of victory. Never again would they resume the offensive in the east. No matter how many lives the Germans claimed, the bodies, sewn like Hydra's teeth, threw up ever stronger Soviet forces. Not even German professionalism could sway the odds in the Wehrmacht's favor. Hitler's war machine was now in full retreat before an ever more powerful antagonist. Ultimate defeat, unthinkable 12 months before, now seemed inevitable.